In the final lecture of this module, we'll focus on the maximal oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, the most widely accepted measure of cardiorespiratory fitness. VO2 max is really the reflection of the combined abilities of the respiratory and cardiovascular systems to deliver oxygen to contracting muscle, and of those muscles to consume oxygen. If we look at the relationship between oxygen uptake and power output, we see this linear relationship. However, depending on the level of training, the level of fitness, and indeed the genetic endowment, the VO2 max level is attained at varying levels. In sedentary individuals, it's relatively low. The value here, 30, is the VO2 max expressed in millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. If we look at normally active individuals, they might be in the range of the 40s to the 50s. If we take those individuals and put them on a training program, we can expect to see an increase of anywhere from 10 to 20% depending on the starting level. If we look at highly trained endurance athletes, we see very high values up here in the 70s, 80s, and in some cases the very low 90s. These very high values probably reflect the combination of genetic endowment and hard physical training. Both are required to really reach these very high levels. In cross-sectional studies that have been taken on various athletic groups, you can see that the VO2 max is generally higher in those groups where there's a heavy reliance on the oxidative energy systems and the cardiorespiratory systems. So in cross-country skiers, in distance runners, speed skaters, these are not the track speed skaters, but more the endurance type speed skating, orienteering and running, cycling, very high values in the 70s, 80s. I think the highest value that's been reported in the literature is 92 for a very well-trained cross-country skier. In the less aerobically dominated events, you can see lower values, and in the untrained values, as I said, 40 to 50. With a period of endurance training, we could expect an increase in that VO2 max value for an untrained individual. If we think about the factors which determine the VO2 max, most of the attention is focused on the oxygen delivery pathways and factors within the muscle. In recent years, it's been suggested that such an approach ignores the important role of the central nervous system in driving people to exercise, recruiting the muscles. And there's no question that the brain has an important role, and motivation during a max test can drive subjects or athletes to a high level. But in terms of limiting the VO2 max, a lot of attention, as I said, has focused on the oxygen delivery pathway. The respiration and the ability to maintain arterial oxygen saturation, the central circulation, the maximal cardiac output and the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, the ability to distribute that blood into the contracting muscles, and finally, the ability of the muscles themselves to consume that oxygen, which is going to be determined by the amount and the extent of mitochondria, the oxidative fuels, and the fibre type, the capillary density. If you look at the relationship between oxygen delivery and the oxidative capacity of the muscle, in small muscle group exercise where the maximal cardiac output is not challenged, the oxygen delivery is more than adequate for the oxidative capacity of those arm muscles. In contrast, if you look at exercise involving the legs and a larger muscle mass, and you begin to approach the maximal limits of cardiac output, the oxygen delivery is somewhat less than the oxidative capacity of the muscle. And this implies that during large muscle mass exercise, it's the oxygen delivery which is really rate limiting for the maximal oxygen uptake. And here's the relationship between VO2 max and oxygen delivery, derived from the earlier slide that I showed you, redrawn with VO2 max now as the dependent variable and oxygen delivery. And we define oxygen delivery as the arterial oxygen content times the cardiac output. And we know that cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. And you can see for those various groups that were listed earlier, sedentary, active, trained, and endurance athlete, with an additional group here studied after a period of bed rest or deconditioning, you can see the relationship between VO2 max and oxygen delivery. And it's for this reason that there's been so much attention focused on the ability to deliver oxygen, and particularly the arterial oxygen content of the blood that's being delivered to the contracting muscles. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. We look at the respiratory system. As we saw in the previous lecture, in most healthy people exercising at sea level, the arterial oxygen content is reasonably well maintained, the arterial oxygen saturation. In some individuals, however, as we discussed, you can see this desaturation. And this is what occurred when these subjects were breathing in air at 21% oxygen, the normal atmospheric oxygen content. Clearly, if you reduce the inspired oxygen partial pressure, for example, if you go to altitude, you see a more pronounced desaturation, and that's not surprising. What was surprising to some was this desaturation on 21%. And as I said, the most likely explanation for this is pulmonary diffusion limitation. You see large increases in cardiac output, maximal cardiac output after training. There's relatively little change in the morphology and the diffusion characteristics of the lung, and this reduction in transit time challenges the ability of the lungs to fully oxygenate the pulmonary blood. If you increase the oxygen in the inspired gas so that these subjects are now breathing 26% oxygen, you can see that you prevent this desaturation and you see a slight increase in the VO2 max. So for some individuals, there may be a pulmonary limitation to their VO2 max. As I said, however, most healthy people exercising at sea level, the lungs are not thought to be a limiting factor for maximal oxygen uptake. There is a plateau in oxygen delivery, and here's the relationship that I showed you earlier between oxygen delivery and VO2. And you can see at the higher intensities here, this leveling off. And this corresponds with a leveling off in cardiac output. And the reason that cardiac output levels off is that stroke volume has leveled off or even declines slightly at maximal exercise. And although heart rate can increase slightly up to its maximal level, this slight reduction in stroke volume means that cardiac output can no longer increase. This has the consequence of limiting the leg blood flow and the leg oxygen delivery. And it's thought that this is an important factor in determining the maximal oxygen uptake. Another experiment that's been used to investigate this is using small muscle group exercise. So single leg exercise where just the knee extensors of the lower leg were used, about 2 to 3 kilo of active muscle mass compared with two-legged cycling, either incremental exercise or very intense exercise up to maximal levels. And you can see with the single leg knee extensor, the ability to increase cardiac output and maximally perfuse this small muscle mass is really quite free and is not limited. In contrast with the two-legged cycling, the increase in cardiac output is somewhat constrained. If you then look at the increase in leg blood flow, you can see at the higher intensities with the larger muscle mass, the inability to maintain that trajectory of increase in leg blood flow and a leveling off. These are some of the data in the literature that suggest that oxygen delivery, as determined by the maximal pumping capacity of the heart, is an important factor in determining VO2 max. The central circulation can influence the maximal cardiac output and the amount of oxygen that is in the arterial blood that can be delivered to the contracting muscle. Alterations in blood volume have an impact on end diastolic volume, maximal stroke volume, and therefore maximal cardiac output. Plasma volume expansion acutely in untrained subjects has been shown to increase the VO2 max. And similarly, loss of central blood volume and dehydration reduces maximal stroke volume, reduces maximal cardiac output. Over the years, there's been some interest in interventions that are aimed at increasing the red cell mass. Blood doping, which has been involves the removal of a small volume of blood, storage in appropriate chemicals, and then reinfusion to increase the blood volume and increase the red cell mass, has been associated with an increase in VO2 max and an increase in exercise performance. And it has been outlawed by various sporting authorities as a form of doping. Erythropoietin, a hormone released from the kidney in response to low oxygen levels, stimulates the production of red cells and was a popular chemical used to try and improve endurance performance. Similarly, that's been banned. And altitude training, one of the adaptations to exposure to altitude is to increase red cell mass. And all of these factors are designed to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the arterial blood, especially in well-trained subjects who, as part of their training, see an increase in their blood volume and a slight reduction in the hemoglobin concentration. So these other interventions have been trialled to increase red cell mass on the back of an expanded blood volume. Increase in cardiac output has to be distributed to the muscles, and there is an association between maximal oxygen uptake and the capillary density of the muscle. So not surprisingly, not only is there an increase in the maximal cardiac output with training, as we saw in the cardiovascular lecture, also an increase in the capillary density, so that the distribution of that cardiac output into the contracting muscles can be optimized. The diffusing capacity in the tissues is also important. The ability of the oxygen to move from the red blood cells in the capillary through the interstitial fluid into the muscle. And this is influenced by a number of factors: the surface area of the capillaries, capillary network, the surface area of the mitochondrial network, the tissue fluid levels, the distances, and all of this is rolled together into a term known as the muscle diffusion capacity. And we know that it does change as a result of exercise training and contributes significantly to the increase in VO2 max following training. It's important to understand that all of the variables involved in oxygen transport to contracting skeletal muscle, and indeed the ability of the muscle to consume that oxygen, all contribute to a maximal oxygen uptake. And as I said at the outset, also the ability to fully activate and recruit those skeletal muscles. Here's an overview of changes in VO2 max that could be predicted to occur with changes in various parameters. And they're listed here: the cardiac output, the diffusing capacity of the lung, the diffusing capacity of the muscle, the hemoglobin concentration, the alveolar ventilation. All of these factors contribute importantly to maximal oxygen uptake. On balance, however, most of the evidence suggests that the ability to deliver muscle to the contracting skeletal muscles is the most important determinant of VO2 max.